Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 27. In today's episode, we're chatting with Esther Mobley on the gripping stories that catapulted her to become the columnist for one of the most prestigious wine columns in North America. That's for the San Francisco Chronicle, and she was just 24 years old. Now, before we get started, I want to give a shout out to two Ottawa sommeliers, Travis and Corey, who said on Instagram, quote, "Hey, Natalie, we are loving the podcast." Well, thank you guys. I'm so glad to hear that. Let me know if you have any suggestions for future guests or topics. I'll continue to give a shout out to others who've been kind enough to post a review on Apple Podcasts, social media, or email. So if you want me to mention your name, your website, and social media handle, please include those in your review. Now, back to this episode. We chat with Esther Mobley about food and wine pairing myths, the rise of commercial wine brands, and her love of a great story. Enjoy. What is it like to interview one of the biggest rock stars on the planet about her new winery and where she is actually the winemaker? And how about food and wine pairing myths? We're going to debunk some of those, and we're going to give you some actual guidelines you can use tonight. And who are the most interesting people and places in the world of wine? Our guest has been the wine columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle since 2015. She covers California wine, beer, and spirits. Previously, she was an assistant editor at the Wine Spectator magazine in New York City. She's also worked harvests in Napa Valley and Mendoza, Argentina, and she studied English literature at the prestigious Smith College in Massachusetts. And she joins me now from her home in San Francisco. Welcome, Esther Mobley. Hello.
Hi, everyone.
Hi. All right. Great to have you.
Glad to be here.
I want to start off kind of going way back with your love of writing. Let's start, well, maybe not at the beginning, but early on, you had a passion for writing. And in fact, as I was doing my research for this, I discovered that your college admission essay, the one you wrote to get into college, was on, I think, the front page or somewhere in the New York Times. Tell us about that. How did that get there? And how did that make you feel? Was that the beginning of it all?
Well, I imagine many people who love writing have loved writing from an early age. I had certainly been writing before that since childhood as an adolescent. The college admissions essay was kind of a sidebar to a larger piece that the New York Times was writing then when I was a senior in high school about how girls were outperforming boys in school and girls were doing better, had a higher rate of admissions to college. I grew up in the suburbs of Boston, Massachusetts. So that was what the piece was about, was high achieving high school girls. And they published, much to my continued embarrassment, my college admissions essay.
Well, that sounds great. I mean, you're getting a front page coverage or whatever, but okay, so you had a love of writing. Did you ever consider, I mean, you're drawn to wine, obviously, working in the wine industry, say as a winemaker or some other capacity versus writing about it? Or did you always know you wanted to write about it?
I never thought wine would be a part of my life. It wasn't a part of my family's life growing up. I had the kind of limited exposure to it that a lot of college students probably have, which involves getting drunk probably a lot of the time. But there was no one in my life who kind of knew about wine or appreciated wine. The way wine ended up entering my life was while I was a senior in college. I was having, as many English majors probably do, especially then, this was kind of amid the recession. I was just wondering, what am I going to do with my life? I don't know. And I figured I was going to eventually probably have some kind of boring desk job. And so I thought, what if I could do something fun, travel and experience something new until that happens? I would have joined the Peace Corps, I would have traveled, but I didn't want to commit to something for 2 years as the Peace Corps would have required. And I needed to like earn at least just a little bit of money just to support myself. So somehow I figured out that you can work harvest at a winery. And frankly, to this day, I don't understand why more people don't use that as like a gap year kind of thing, because it's a 5, 6 month commitment. You earn like minimum wage and you get to experience some beautiful place. So I went to Napa the fall after I graduated from college to work a harvest season just for fun. I mean, I never imagined it would lead to a career or anything more than just a kind of fun excursion before I returned to, again, what I imagined was a life doomed to like something what I probably saw in Office Space.
So glad you avoided that sad existence. But what gave you the idea for wine as opposed to going to work a farm and milk cows or any other gap year activity? What twigged you onto wine?
I toyed with all of those. Woofing, where you offer yourself as free labor in exchange for room and board to an organic farm, that appealed to me too. I loved the idea of working with my hands. The way it ended up being wine was that I discovered an alumna of Smith who had graduated about 10 years earlier and was a winemaker in Napa. Her name is Helen Keplinger. She's a well known winemaker here in California. She has her own label called Keplinger, and she's been the winemaker for Bryant and still is for Carte Blanche and Force Majeure. I reached out to her and she kind of helped guide me through the process of applying to harvest jobs, helped explain to me what it was, and she has remained a mentor to me ever since.
That's terrific. So, Esther, was there a pivotal wine that you had that really turned you on to, oh my gosh, this wine, what is this? This is something I need to dig into as well.
Well, it's funny. I mean, I'm sure this is like the opposite of how it happens for most people, but I really arrived in Napa that fall. I was so green. I really didn't know. And what turned me on to wine was not really the experience of drinking wine, but helping to make wine that season. We were tasting constantly finished wines as well as the wines we were making. This was a winery in Rutherford in Napa Valley called Round Pond Estate. So we had a huge estate vineyard, about 400 acres. And I was in the vineyard all the time. I was working in the lab. I had been an English major, not really done much work in the sciences in college. I learned how to drive a forklift. And it was really the whole holistic experience of that rather than just one isolated bottle of wine that made me fall in love with it.
I love that you come from it from that perspective of making it. Do you think that wine columnists or those who write about wine should have the experience of making it?
It certainly helps. I rely constantly on the knowledge I gained during that and then a subsequent harvest I worked. Although I think, as with a food critic, it's not necessary for a food critic to be a chef. I think it's very possible to master your craft and have a different kind of critical sense of it if you haven't made it. But for me, it really has helped me. And I would not have gotten the jobs I have in writing about wine if I hadn't had that experience.
So that's where it started. Almost George Plimpton, like the writer who used to do what he wrote about from football to other topics. And then yet you can say, well, you don't have to be an arsonist to write about house fires. So there's the two sides of the argument. So from that Napa Valley harvest, is that how you segued into a job with the Wine Spectator?
No, that was still a little whiles off. So
Okay.
I worked that harvest in Napa, and around me were people who were all applying to work harvest jobs in the Southern Hemisphere. That's, of course, what aspiring winemakers do. They gain more experience and kind of hop between the hemispheres. So suddenly, everyone I knew, including my best friend from college who had come out and done this whole thing with me, she got a job at a winery in Sonoma, and we were kind of buddies, and she's still a winemaker. We were applying to jobs in Australia, in New Zealand, and I ended up getting a job in Argentina.
Which winery?
It was called Bodega Roland. It's owned by Michel Roland, the
Ah,
consultant. He consults for a number of properties down in Argentina, but this is one that he owns. And it's in the Uco Valley. They make a couple of different labels, one that's called Val de Flores and one that's called Miraflor. We wouldn't see a bottle that says Bodega Roland, but the way a lot of at least American wine consumers know it is that it's part of this group called the Clos de los Siete, a few wineries that are right there next to each other, blend together a wine they make every year. And it's like a $20 Malbec blend that sells here.
wow. Okay. You love storytelling. I know that. You love long form narrative. What is it about digging down, digging deep that satisfies you? Why do you like that?
I just do. I don't know. I mean, to me, there's nothing more satisfying than finding a great story and then being able somehow to tell it. I enjoy so much the reporting aspect of it and getting to know people, really trying to understand their story. That's half the writing, more than half the writing, maybe. And then, as I imagine a lot of other writers do, there's just something so satisfying to me about actually putting pen to paper or fingertips to keyboard and producing something that I'm proud of. Gets me high.
That's good. And so, how do you get past the press release language, the standard statements? How do you get people talking real talk, giving you a real inside story that you want?
It can be tough. And as I'm sure you have experienced too, there are some people who I think you kind of will never get past that with. Some people, I'm sure it's different for every person, but whether they're not really comfortable, whether they've been given orders by their publicist, I think you can just tell with some people whether you're really ever going to have a genuine reaction, a kind of real interaction. I really think I seek people out who I can sense I'm having a genuine connection with and I'm really speaking to. And there's a lot of people out there like that, but I'm always polite and publicists can be very helpful in many ways. And I just think if there's someone who's not really giving me a real story and is just speaking in kind of PR jargon, that sometimes I won't really find a way to write about it.
Do you find the car technique helpful, interviewing people in cars?
Yeah, I know I've spoken about this before in
Yeah.
other interviews, but I really find that that is sometimes the best way to get a great interview. I used to use a voice recorder when I was doing in person interviews,
Uh huh.
and I stopped doing that a couple of years ago. Maybe I'm wrong, but I sensed that people spoke differently when they knew they were being recorded. So I just take notes by hand and then do a lot of follow up if I need to check things. I'm a pretty fast writer. But when you're driving in the car, usually I'm in the passenger seat. And usually in those cases, I'm not writing at all, especially if we're like on a bumpy vineyard road. But I find that it's those long periods of time when you're not sitting at a table with wine in front of you, kind of intensely tasting, when you have a lot of extra time and you've gotten past the big questions and now you're just kind of chatting, that's when people open up. And I seek out those moments. It can take a lot longer than just picking up the phone and doing a quick interview. And frequently that's all I can do because of time and space constraints. I love that car time. I really think that's when the conversation gets rich.
Absolutely. Car time. I like that. It's when I've had the best conversations with my son, when we're both staring ahead yeah, it's less intense. It's less one on one, eye to eye. There's something about that where it's the movement, but also the focus is not directly on the other person. What is that comedy sketch? Coffee in the car with, I don't know,
Oh, I don't know.
like Jerry Seinfeld gets in the car, has
Yeah. Oh,
coffee
yeah.
with other
Riding in
comedians.
cars with comedians or something. Yeah.
Exactly, and then there's the other guy who sings,
The car
singers.
karaoke, carpool
Exactly. There's
karaoke.
something
Yeah.
about the car that's magical. I know you're an avid reader of The New Yorker, so do you try to model your stories after those in that even if I didn't have or wasn't obsessed with wine, I'd still wanna read a story. Do you take that sort of approach as well?
Yes, I certainly wouldn't flatter myself to compare my work to anything that appears in the New Yorker, but absolutely, I have a New Yorker sitting here right in front of me. But that's my model that I want to write stories that are interesting enough that someone who's interested in great stories and interesting things would want to read it, whether or not they have a deep interest in wine. In any given issue of The New Yorker, I might be reading about the oil industry in Texas or deep philosophical questions about why we make decisions the way we do, or sex scandals at the New York City Ballet. And none of those things are topics I would come up with as an interest of mine. But when something is written well and when some writer has happened upon a deeply interesting subject, I think I want to read it. I think those are the readers of the San Francisco Chronicle, too. Our readership here in the Bay Area is smart. They're sophisticated. Many of them know something about food and wine. They eat good food. They drink good wine. They visit our wine country here. But I don't assume that any of my readers are reading the online forums. And I want my stories to just be great stories to them.
Again, I have to concur on the reprint of my book. I wanted to put a quote from a reader who said she enjoyed my book and she's a teetotaler. So
That's great.
but
Yeah,
they wouldn't
exactly.
let me. But anyway, I think it is a good compliment to the power of storytelling if you can reach people that way. Esther, I know you've been the columnist since 2015. What have been the major changes since you've taken helm? I know it hasn't been that long, but in the last 3 to 4 years with California wine, what's changed? What's different?
Well, I think a lot of the changes that are happening have been in the works for a long time. Of course, wine moves slowly. You just get one shot a year. But I think the larger thing we've been seeing over the last decade is a real movement away from an era of ripeness and opulence that characterized California wine in the early 2000s. Everywhere I go, I'm seeing wines that are really being made with an eye toward grapes being picked earlier, embracing a kind of leaner, more old fashioned profile. I think I knew that before I joined the Chronicle 3.5 years ago, but that's what people want to talk to me about. Natural wine continues to grow here. When I joined 3.5 years ago, I think I might have thought that was a blip on the radar or was kind of already on its way down. What we're seeing here in the Bay Area, both in terms of what restaurants and bars are serving and in terms of what California winemakers are making, the idea of natural wine is just on the rise a lot. When I joined, I think I might have thought that the conversation about lower alcohol was simply about picking grapes a little bit earlier. And I'm going to be writing about this. I have a couple stories in the works that get at this in a couple of different ways. We're seeing, I think, a fundamental shift in questioning what's supposed to be planted where. We're seeing more grapes like Gamay and Cinsault, kind of lighter bodied wines. I think there's more interest in that. And we'll see how things progress over time. But I do think we're in the midst of a long ranging shift.
Shift toward more lower alcohol, more elegance, that kind of thing?
Yes. And I doubt that would be news to many of your readers. Again, I
Sure.
think we've been hearing about that and tasting that for a few years now. But I really see its momentum. I think it's still moving.
Absolutely. And natural wine, you mentioned that. So I just want your take on that. Some people call it a fad, others say it's a good move toward non interventionism. What is your take on natural wine?
I'm still formulating my take on natural wine, partially because I have yet to fully understand what natural wine really is. I think it's frustrating. We don't have a kind of strict definition of it, although maybe that's the beauty of it. A few years ago, I think I had a much more negative sense of what natural wine was. Maybe that was because my initial exposures to wine were making wine that certainly didn't feel industrial or over manipulated, but embraced the use of sulfur as a preservative and embraced fining and filtration. And I added DAP to kickstart yeast. I inoculated fermentations with commercial yeast. And I just thought these wines aren't any less soulful for it. I remain a little bit unconvinced by the notion that sulfur is a poison to you. I know a lot of people in the natural wine world believe that. I'm not sure I do, but I'm certainly all for safer and more sustainable practices in the vineyard. And I wish that were more at the center of the natural wine conversation here in California. I think it just simply makes better wine, and we need to be thinking about the future of the land. When it comes to the wines themselves, I'm interested in them the way I'm interested in any other wine. And I think a lot of natural wines that have things many of us might consider flaws I think they're really challenging the notion of what wine is supposed to be. And I sometimes struggle to enjoy a wine that has like acetic acid or volatile acidity, of course. But the fact that so many other people seem to be interested in them makes me curious and want to understand what the appeal is. And I'm just trying to remain an open-minded drinker.
There you go. That's good. A beginner or enthusiast mind is always refreshing. And they say there's more sulfites in, what is it, a glass of orange juice than a bottle of wine.
And people eat dried apricots. And yeah, it's hard to argue with empirical evidence of what people say they experience when they've had something. I believe people, and I certainly don't consider myself the expert on any of this, but I eat dried fruit. I drink orange juice, and we probably all consume a lot of things in our daily lives that we need to scrutinize more closely.
Perhaps, just not wine. Leave that off the table. As I tell my doctor regularly, I don't want to talk about it. So let's turn to an organic wine producer, a winemaker you interviewed in 2018. Tell me about Alicia Moore. What drew you to this story? How did you find out about this California winemaker?
It's a funny story. So Alicia Moore is better known as Pink, the musician.
Yes.
Her publicist is someone I have known for a while and I've worked with on other stories, and someone I really trust and know understands what I do and the kinds of stories I tell. So this woman had reached out to me several times and kind of explained that she has this new client and never mentioned Pink. Initially didn't even mention the name Alicia Moore, and was simply telling me, I have this client who has this really exciting new estate in Santa Barbara County. The wines are really beautiful. They're getting released. And it sounded like an ambitious project, but not necessarily any more interesting than any other thoughtfully planned new estate vineyard. I was kind of talking to her about it, and I said, okay, I'm going to come down to Santa Barbara anyway. I'll come down. And it was truly only after having committed already to go down there that I put the pieces together. I mean, I think the name Alicia Moore had been mentioned somewhere in there, and I Googled, it's spelled unconventionally for Alicia. I Googled it and I was like, oh my gosh, this is Pink. So maybe that was the grand tactic the whole time, because Alicia clearly really wants to be taken seriously as a winemaker and does not want her wines to rest on her music career.
Obviously, that she didn't launch a rosé, call it Pink, and call it a day.
Right. And I'm sure she could have a lot of success that way. But the one thing that I really came to understand as I then met her and visited her vineyard and spent time with her there and tasted her wines was that she's really aching to be a true part of the wine community. And I really believe she has a lot of respect for her fellow winemakers. She has really tried to ingratiate herself into the community down there. And she's trying to do something in a real and thoughtful way.
Yeah, I love that. She really is yurting, isn't she? It's not only an organic winery. Her name is not associated with the label, which is Two Wolves, but she is serious. She's not just another celeb label. She doesn't have her name on the label or even owning the winery. She's actually taken some serious wine training. What has she done to train herself?
She took a number of WSET classes. I don't know now to what level, but I had never known that. I mean, she was describing having to leave concerts in Australia, which is where her biggest fan base is, incidentally, and running backstage still in her leotard to go take her WSET exam online. I mean, who knew?
Wow.
And she had traveled extensively to wine regions. She loves Chateauneuf-du-Pape. She loves Australian wine, New Zealand wine. She spent a lot of time in Oregon and the Willamette Valley. She loves Clos Rougeard. I mean, I've interviewed a lot of celebrity winemakers and celebrities who purport to be interested in wine. That was a little column I did at Wine Spectator, actually. But I had not encountered anyone who knew or had visited a winery as kind of insidery and as Clos Rougeard. I mean, you kind of have to know something about wine to know that's cool. It's not just like
Sassicaia or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. So I was very impressed by that.
Yeah, she has a desire, it seems, because she was off the grid for 5 years doing this winery. Of course, her children were young, but she really seemed to dig in. She's not just the owner, she's actually the winemaker, which just surprised me to no end.
Right. And she does have a really talented and experienced on the ground winemaker named Allison Thompson, who I've written about, who's there day to day. Because Alicia was on tour for much of this year, but she's like out there picking the grapes. I mean, I kind of wanted to say to her, like, do you know most winemakers aren't out there picking the grapes? That's not like part of the job description.
You can
don't have
hire
to do
people to
that.
do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's funny. Wow.
I think I have a pretty good bullshit detector. I hope I do. And
Aha.
it didn't go off when I was with her. I
Wow.
really sensed that she cared about this and she seemed nervous during our interview, really nervous, like
Wow.
she was really hoping that she could be recognized for doing this, not just as a kind of helicopter and celebrity.
Absolutely. Well, she joins the pantheon, I guess. British pop star Mike Hucknall didn't call his wine Simply Red, and Brangelina, they didn't put their name on Miraval, though I don't know post-divorce who got custody of that French winery.
That's still a news topic.
Yeah, exactly. But it's interesting that she is really digging in there and trying to produce something. And almost, I don't know, maybe it was the grand strategy of not revealing who it was behind this winery until it had to be revealed. And she sold out of her wine. I guess it was only 115 cases, but in 24 hours. Do you think that people are just knew who she was then and it was a celebrity bump?
She has some really devoted fans of her music, and I'm sure that many of them were eager to taste her wine.
Sure.
I have no doubt. And again, right, it wasn't very much wine, so you wouldn't have expected it to take a long, long time to sell. But I imagine too that there was a lot of curiosity around. She sounds like she's serious. If people had read my or other articles that came out subsequently, I imagine there was a lot of curiosity of like, are these wines really good? And Allison, her assistant winemaker, is beloved in the Santa Barbara County wine community and known. Alicia got kind of the most coveted wine label designer in California,
Hmm.
Michael McDermott, to do the labels. She certainly associated herself with people who are well respected in the California wine industry.
As opposed to just a marketing focus group. So the two wolves comes after the Cherokee parable of the two wolves that fight inside each of us. Which one wins? One represents light or dark, or our better impulses, our worse impulses. And the elder Cherokee chief is trying to instruct his grandson. And he says, which wolf wins or survives? He says, the one you feed. Do you think there's anything in terms of Alicia choosing that? Being torn between the pop star and the winemaker? I mean, is there anything, or am I just reading too much into it?
Well, that's how I interpreted it. And asked her that. I can't remember. I don't think I got a super straight answer from her about it. If
Okay.
I do, I'm forgetting. But that's how I interpreted it, that she's a person of paradoxes and
Yes.
contains multitudes.
Absolutely. Her songs have been my anthem for years, from Sober to Raise a Glass. Let's turn to another California wine, Esther, the Meiomi brand, which you wrote about. And it's an interesting paradox. Like, yeah, so it's sold to the conglomerate Constellation, which used to own Artira here in Canada, Jackson Triggs, Inniskillen, lots of big wine brands. It sold for 350 million without any assets, no vineyard, nothing in 2015. What was your take on that?
To me, that's just fascinating that anything could sell that basically has no physical inventory. It's just a brand for $315 million. So I was fascinated by that and wrote a big profile of Joe the next year simply because I thought, what does this signify for California moving forward? And he's a fascinating character to me for a number of reasons. He comes from, of course, this kind of California wine dynasty. His father, Chuck Wagner, owns Caymus. His other siblings have also gone off kind of from the Caymus diaspora and made their own wines. Joe Wagner was kind of right there with his original Pinot Noir label, Belle Gloss, in the wake of Sideways and this kind of huge California Pinot Noir craze that followed. So to me, there's a lot of fascinating threads that he kind of intersects. And in late 2018, he was in the news quite a lot again for two reasons. He has a couple of brands based on Oregon Pinot Noir.
Okay.
And there was a lot of uproar in Oregon over how he was labeling his wines, that he was potentially not really authorized, according to our appellation rules, to use the term Willamette Valley on his bottles. Similarly, he canceled a number of contracts with growers in Southern Oregon, citing smoke taint. There had been massive wildfires in Southern Oregon, and a lot of growers felt like he had left them high and dry at the last minute and couldn't sell their grapes. Anyway, there's a lot more to all of those stories, but he's a person who, I don't know, he's an important and interesting figure in West Coast wine right now. Maybe not all for the right reasons, but interesting nonetheless.
And when it comes to Meiomi, do you think Meiomi as a brand is good for California wine? You hear the statements over and over again, wines made in the vineyard, non-interventionist, all this. This is a winery that sold without a vineyard. I mean, sure, they got grapes from contractors, but I know it depends on how you define authentic, but is that authentic wine? What is that?
Well, Meiomi is not an authentic wine, no matter how you cut it. I don't think I could make that argument. I don't know the percentages offhand, but it's got Gewürztraminer and Grenache in it. I mean, it's labeled as Pinot Noir. It has at least 75% Pinot Noir, but it's got these other kind of crazy blends. To me, it's not a great example of California Pinot Noir varietal character, but of course, it's massively popular. The New York Times wine columnist Eric Asimov recently had a piece in which he suggested that his readers go out and buy Meiomi Pinot Noir and two other popular supermarket wine brands. And that caused a bit of an uproar. A lot of people said, how could you endorse a wine like this? And I don't think he was endorsing it. I think he just thought it would be an interesting and an instructive exercise to see this is one of the most popular wines in America. Whether it's good for California wine, I don't know. I think there's an argument to be made for that wine being a kind of gateway wine to other California Pinots. It's an affordable wine-ish. It's about $20 a bottle. I actually think you can get better, more interesting wines for much less than that here. But I think when a wine like that becomes so massively popular, it warrants our attention. We should all be thinking, what does this mean? And how is this influencing people and other wines?
What do you think it means? What happened? What caused its popularity?
So I think a number of things. I think Pinot Noir is still riding a big wave of popularity. And Meiomi is an example of a Pinot Noir that has the heft and alcohol content of a bigger, fuller bodied wine, but still has a lot of fruit. I don't know off the top of my head whether it's dry. I certainly haven't had it tested. It doesn't taste entirely dry to me. So I think it's the wine that capitalizes on mass markets' demand for sweeter, really boldly flavored wines, which I don't think is new to Meiomi. I think that's a tried and true recipe that's been around for quite a while.
All right. So I wanted to also get to some of these food and wine pairings that you've been exploring. You did a seminar with the science or technical writer at the Chronicle. Remind me of that writer's name?
His name is Ali Bouzari. He's a food scientist here locally, and he writes a column once a month for us on the side.
Ah, great. And so you two were exploring food and wine pairing myths and pairing guidelines. What did you come up with there? What is bunk and what could work? What could help us?
I learned a lot from Ali just about the kind of science behind flavor. I think many of your listeners may be aware that our tongue is capable of really only tasting five things. So they say, the five tastes: sweet, salty, sour, bitter, and umami. Whereas our nose is capable of detecting infinitely more molecules. And what we ultimately perceive in our palate when we're tasting wine or anything else is a composite image from our tongue and our nose, which we're smelling retronasally. That's what we end up perceiving as flavor, is all of that kind of taken together. One thing Ali was explaining a lot is that it really is all subjective. And for instance, the famous experiment where someone takes a glass of white wine and puts red food coloring in it and then the so-called expert tasters perceive it as a red wine. I don't think that disproves their expertness. We really are tasting with our eyes and our sense of touch and our ears as much as with our nose and our mouth. And the color red is sending real signals to our brain. I mean, we're not making it up when we see something red and have a kind of taste memory that we associate with. It's giving our brain a powerful message. So I thought that was really interesting.
They've done studies too where they'll do a test and they'll write the word, say, blue, but the letters will be in red. And there's a significant slowdown on the response time of people trying to read the words because we do perceive with our eyes. For sure, it has a real impact.
Yeah. And if you're warm, if you're touching something soft, it plays a role. And we're kind of helpless to all the signals we're getting.
And there's crossover between the senses too, which I find interesting when they start to play certain music and then drink the wine and it affects your perception of the wine. They do. That cross-modal interpretation is a whole new field. So what food and wine pairing myths did you debunk? Anything that comes to mind, like as the big ones?
Well, one thing is there's this idea of super tasters. I don't know if you've spoken about this before, but I had originally once thought that super tasters actually had like more taste buds than non-tasters. But as Ali explained the other day, all it means is that there's a certain bitterness compound that super tasters are very sensitive to. And actually, it makes a lot of foods quite unpleasant for them. So I think it's a myth that a super taster is a better wine taster or would be a better chef, for instance, than a non-taster. In fact, the non-tasters may actually experience more pleasure out of a greater range of foods and wines, but also might be better because they can experience a fuller array of flavors than super tasters who end up kind of being pickier.
Be more like of the populace to recommend wines. What about the whole red wine steak? Did you guys explore any of that?
We didn't talk about that specifically, but one fascinating thing we did was that we put 2 glasses of water in front of everyone. One had a little bit of salt in it, and one had a lot of salt in it. So when you tasted the first one that had a little bit of salt, we all tasted it. And yeah, I mean, it tastes gross. It's salt water. I mean, it tasted salty. Then you taste the second one, which is much saltier, and swish it around in your mouth, swish it around in your mouth. And when you go back to the first glass, it actually tasted sweet. The relative saltiness of one to the other resulted in something that actually tasted sweet. It was crazy because a moment before that same glass of wine had tasted really pretty salty. To me, that just has all kinds of implications for the way we taste wine and food together. The crazy importance of the context and going between one thing and another. Another thing we did was we had a lightly sweet wine. It was a Moscato with a very, very sweet butterscotch pudding. So both the wine and the food were sweet, but the food was much sweeter than the wine. But the food really makes the wine so bitter. I would have ordered those together in a restaurant, right? A kind of light sweet dessert wine with a sweet dessert. But the degree of sweetness of the food can really, really throw the wine out of whack, even if it's already sweet.
I have to concur. And we were talking about this earlier, but when I sit down, taste maybe 40, 50 wines, it's always by comparison. What did you taste before this wine? And what did you taste after? It can just totally throw your perception. And many as a time, I've bought a wine that I wanted for personal consumption that I had at a tasting. At the tasting, it was great. But it was like, as I said, meeting a guy in a bar. It's a noisy bar. And he's great. He's telling you fun stories. Then you get him home and he doesn't lower his voice. It's not the inside voice. It's still loud. And it's like, what was I thinking taking this guy home? Anyway.
Yeah, like Ali was bringing up the example of someone visiting a tasting room at a winery where you're surrounded by beautiful scenery and you're seeing all these other people enjoying the wine and you love the wine and you buy the wine. And then you get it back to your small, dirty apartment and you're like, this tastes terrible. And duh, I mean,
it's
things
context.
taste a lot better when you're sitting on a patio in beautiful Napa Valley.
Exactly. Context. The wine hasn't changed. You have.
And so that's real. We're not making it up in our heads. Our bodies are performing this complicated dance.
The dance. Absolutely. Now, Esther, as we come to a close here, is there anything that we haven't covered that you'd like to mention at this point?
Oh, one thing you asked was if any of my stories resulted in any concrete changes.
Yes, to the wine industry. Yeah.
Well, at the risk of sounding self promotional, one interesting thing that I think came out of something was about a year and a half ago, I discovered that Constellation, the same company that had bought Meiomi from Joe Wagner, had filed a trademark for a new winery called Tokalon Wine Company. And of course, Tokalon is a famous vineyard in Napa that has been in existence since the 19th century and is owned by multiple entities. No one owns it entirely, but Robert Mondavi, which is owned by Constellation, owns a portion of it. A well-known grape grower named Andy Beckstoffer owns a portion of it. And there have been many trademark battles in the past between these owners who argue over who really has the right to use the name Tokalon. Robert Mondavi holds a trademark. Andy Beckstoffer sued the winery Constellation over it before. Anyway, so Constellation had filed a trademark to start a new wine label just called Tokalon that was going to be separate from Robert Mondavi Winery. And I reported on that, which again, I think raises all these interesting questions about who has the right to call their wine that? Does the place name transcend any trademark rights? And subsequently, they withdrew their request for a trademark.
Wow, congratulations.
I don't have a stake in it, but I thought it was really interesting.
That is a huge company. Constellation, as I said, used to own Artira Wines here in Canada. They represent here in Canada Robert Mondavi, Kim Crawford, Ruffino, Jackson Triggs, Inniskillen. They're a huge, huge company. So that is interesting that they backed off on that. Wow, that's good though. I think place deserves more than just a marketing trademark. It's beyond that. It should be.
I think especially Napa Valley itself and many of its wineries are really kind of trademarked up. The Napa Valley itself has a trademark and they're
Ah,
really vigilant about people using it inappropriately. There was a whole thing back in the 90s here with Bronco Wine Company owned by
right.
Fred Franzia calling something Napa Cellars, even though it was made over in like Fresno,
Yeah.
basically. So, yeah, I think it'll be interesting to watch over the coming decades if we see anything more concrete. I mean, it's hard to imagine us developing a kind of Burgundy like cruise system, that a vineyard like Tokalon, where, like Burgundy, a lot of different people have different pieces of this famous vineyard. Again, to me, it raises a lot of interesting questions.
Well, it's the antithesis. The Tokalon reminds me of Clos de Vougeot in Burgundy, which has like 82 owners.
Everyone has a tiny
A
bit.
vine, yes. Versus we're going through the same thing here in Canada. We have cellared in Canada. So the juice can be from anywhere. People think they're buying a Canadian product. It's very misleading. And there's a lot of fight now to just get that done away with, that whole designation of cellar in Canada. So,
Yeah,
like,
it's interesting.
wow. Okay. So, Esther, where can we find you online?
You can find me at sfchronicle.com/wine. If you're ever in California, you can find me in the Sunday print, San Francisco Chronicle. You can find me on Instagram at Esther Mob, ESTHERMOB, on Twitter at Esther_Mobley. And I also keep a repository of my work at esthermobley.com.
Esther, what a great conversation. It's gone by in a snap. Fantastic story. So I look forward to staying in touch and perhaps getting you back here if you have the time, because there's so many more questions I wanted to ask you. But thank you for being
Great.
here.
Yeah,
And
it's been a pleasure.
absolutely. So we'll say bye for now, and we'll be following your work online, Esther.
Thanks. Yeah.
Okay, bye bye. Wasn't that terrific? Here are my takeaways from our discussion. Number one, Esther is bang on with her observations of Californian wines, moving toward a more refreshing style with lighter bodied wines rather than the high alcohol fruit bombs made with excessively ripe grapes. Number two, I admire how she sees the duality of natural wines. Their lack of definition is both a frustration and part of their beauty. Conversely, she believes that commercial wines aren't necessarily any less soulful than so-called artisanal wines, or even natural wines. Number three, she also sees the duality in people, like Alicia Pink. And it's that duality that makes them nuanced and complex. Number 4, I thought Esther's experiment with the relative saltiness between 2 glasses of salted water was fascinating. Context is everything. And that's why I also use a technique in my online courses where we taste wine, then lick some salt, and then go back to the wine. You'll be amazed at what happens to your perception of the wine. So you'll find links to Esther's online wine columns and to her social media handles in the show notes at nataliemaclean.com/27. Did you know that you can listen to this podcast on your smart speaker? Just say, "Hey Google," or "Alexa, play the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast." I love to chat about wine with you while you're doing the dishes, the laundry, having breakfast, lunch, or dinner because, yes, it's always wine time. So, what was your favorite tip or quote from this episode? Please share that with me on Twitter or Facebook and tag me at Natalie MacLean. On Instagram, I'm at Natalie MacLean Wine. If you like this episode, please tell a friend about it, especially one who is really interested in gripping wine stories and even that really smart insider story about Pink. My podcast is easy to find. You can just search on Google for its name, the Unreserved Wine Talk Podcast, or on my name. Finally, if you want to take your ability to pair wine and food to the next level, join me in a free online video class at nataliemaclean.com/class. On next week's show, I'll be chatting about wines for Father's Day. Manly, yes, but I like them too. See you then. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So, subscribe for free now at nataliemaclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.